You're listening to The Chronomancer and the Book of Worms, Book 1 of the Destiny of the Void Triangle. Written by Jason Harrington. Narrated by Mason Hamilton. Chapter 3. The next day, Rylan woke to a bright sunrise of crisp air and chirping bird songs. He still felt tired and sore from the sowing labor of the day before. Every seed in the basket now nestled in the soft earth. He spent much of the evening with his family foraging in the woods for supper. There was not much to be found, yet, and his stomach growled, unsatisfied. Hunger could not diminish the giddy sense of excitement Rylan felt with the promising dawn. Perhaps Ishel did have a plan that would satiate them all, or maybe it would simply be a day spent relaxing with his closest friend. He couldn't discount the possibility that Ishel's plan would succeed. She had always proven to be as intelligent as she was resourceful. Rylan hurried out of the bed and into his worn brown clothes. He would have fetched something to eat, if there was anything. Instead, he diligently clung to the hope that fate would provide. In minutes, he dashed out the door of the low-ceilinged hovel and rushed to the shack by Ernic's forge. Many of the villagers already left for the fields. The dirty streets were mostly quiet. A few people remained, carrying broken farm tools. Ernic didn't have enough time to warn everyone, so it was to be expected. Rylan could hear the angry shouts from the forge long before he arrived. The yells of profanity belonged solely to the bear-like smith, and Rylan knew the farmers would be keeping a tentative distance. Rylan drew himself to a halt a few yards from the cautious villagers. Not surprisingly, Isha was seated on her makeshift stool, a bored, impatient look on her face. She seemed oblivious to her father's tirade, creating a comical contrast between her and the nervous farmers. Beside her, on the ground, was a wooden crate. Its contents of rope and bits of metal seemed like no more than scrounged materials. But these were the pieces she scavenged for after the first failed attempts using vines and broken branches.
Finally!
Ishel sighed with equal exasperation and relief.
It's so tedious listening to my father swear about the merchants.
I came as fast as my feet would carry me.
So, you were about to sleep the day?
Ishel teased as she gathered her crate and led the way. Rylan looked at Ishel and her crate, then shook his head. It looks the same, Ishel. What plan could you possibly have? He asked as they walked. Ishel feigned an offended expression.
You doubt me now? For shame.
What is your plan? Rylan pressed.
A surprise and a secret.
Ishel played. Rylan lowered and shook his head, chuckling. Knowing Ishel, she held a few pieces of bread from the winter that she meant to use to catch a more filling meal. Her improvised bait tended to vary, depending on what she could find. It only worked half the time. They walked into the woods for an hour. As the number of trees thinned, Rylan heard the sound of churning water. Their favorite narrows were close by. It was a place where the current slowed sufficiently. They approached the break in the trees and sat on two low, round boulders. Sunlight spilled through the canopy and glistened over the river's bubbling surface. The waters were waist deep and good for catching fish. Ishel quickly rummaged through her crate and produced two lines with metal hooks at the end. Rylan eyed her dubiously and said nothing when the bread was impaled on her line. Ishel turned her intense focus from the bait, meeting Rylan's expression.
You know full well this is neither a surprise or secret. Just you watch. We will eat well tonight.
Without another word, Ishel turned her full attention to the hook. Her gaze became distant, and her mouth moved soundlessly. Her hands circled and twirled about the hook. As she did this, Rylan felt a stirring of gentle air all over his body. It tickled and caressed him, teasing his skin and nerves. Ishel's task was complete within seconds, and Rylan gasped with a realization. Ishel smiled jovially as she looked up to meet his shocked expression.
We should have brought big pails for the fish.
Ishel cast the baited line into the water. Instantly, the water around the hook boiled fervently as the fish struggled for their prize. The first fish to bite the hook was a trout the size of Rylan's arm. It required both their efforts to wrench it free of the water. The strain wasn't small, leaving both of them winded on their backs. Sorcery! Rylan managed as he struggled to regain his wind. When did you know?
Before the first snow.
Ishel answered, slightly less exhausted.
At first, only lighting fires for my father. I can't do much yet. Only fires and fish.
The enlightened sun? Rylan offered.
Doesn't even know our village exists, Rylan.
Ishel snapped.
How do you forget that everyone's eyes are away from us?
Rylan thought about that a moment while he laid on the riverbank. The Order of the Enlightened Sun was a gathering of sorcerers that aided every nation in Stratia. They advised kings and rulers, sought arcane wisdom, and even settled wars for 2,000 years. Ishel's newfound talent would be a welcome addition to them. But the nobles of Malkanor wanted every lowborn resident to remain as they were slaves.
Come on, Rylan.
Ishel ordered, standing and ending any further thought on the matter.
The fish won't catch themselves. It's too fine a day to brood.
Rylan complied, and the day continued without any more to darken the mood. Ishel wielded her newfound magic again and again, and their pile of fish became considerably bigger. In time, Rylan was forced to find some branches and vines to tie the fish onto. "We should stop now," Rylan suggested in the late afternoon. "It's already getting too heavy." Rylan resisted the impulse to tell her that he could read Ishel's exhaustion plainly. Sweat beaded on her forehead and soaked her hair. Her breathing was labored and her eyes drooped wearily. Clearly, her magic was taking a toll on her. Ishel decided she would leave her crate in the lee of a tree until the next day. Rylan knew she could only do so much now, and did not challenge her decision. It would be enough just for the two of them to haul so much fish at once. Halfway on their trek back home, Ishel's fatigue began to take greater hold. Their pace slowed greatly. Sunset was beginning to darken the woods, and she could barely keep from tripping over her own feet. Rylan drew them to a halt, placing his end of the branches down adamantly. "You need to rest a moment, Ishel. I don't know what your magic did, but I think it made you more tired for it somehow. I've never heard of anyone from the Enlightened Sun becoming so tired."
Then they know something I don't.
Ishel countered irritably. "Where did you get so many fish?" demanded a boy's voice accusingly, before Rylan could sit down. Rylan rarely heard that voice, but he both dreaded and knew who it would be before he turned around. The Crown Prince of Malkanor. Amorlik Morinroke was well known to every villager, and as welcome as any catastrophe. Roughly the same age as Rylan, he was extremely well muscled for a boy his age. He was blonde-haired and blue-eyed. His pale complexion showed little exposure to the sun, and no scarring from labor. He wore a velvet azure doublet and pants trimmed with artful gold embroidery. He also wore shining black leather boots with brass buckles. He scowled, an expression that seemed permanently chiseled into place. Beside Amorlik stood a middle-aged woman only slightly taller and slender. Her long dark hair was tied behind her neck. Her skin was only a little darkened, but her face showed the worry lines that reflected wisdom and struggle. Her dark brown eyes spoke of exasperation and annoyance with the Crown Prince. Her favored plain, thick brown robe and sandals only told Rylan that she was anything but ordinary. The woman was Ard Solis. The whole of Malkanor knew the sorceress was originally sent by the Grand Illumination to advise the king. Due to the queen's scheming, however, Matesius's role was reduced to watching over Amorlik. "I asked you a question, animals, and I expect an answer now!" Amorlik's voice grew louder as he approached them.
We caught them,"
Ishel answered, still fighting to steady her breath. "Pathetic answer! No manners!" Amorlik continued as he closed the distance to Ishel. "And you animals always seem to forget to kneel to your future king!" he shouted as he rammed his fist into Ishel's belly.
"Enough, your highness!"
Matesia shouted.
"Beating the villagers is behavior beneath your station!"
Amorlik spun and faced Matesia, furiously. "Silence, witch! What can a nursemaid like you possibly know of my station?"